Fine. So, good evening to everybody. On a day like this, I was rather reluctant to extend a warm welcome to you, but in here it's already a different story, so let me extend a warm and very cordial welcome to all of you at the IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences. I am Ludger Hagedorn. The name needs spelling, but you have it here in the last line. The name needs spelling. Permanent fellow here at the Institute for Human Sciences. The new sciences of the artificial and why we maybe still need philosophy. This is the topic that we are dealing with today. And the very first and special welcome goes to Viola Schiaffonati. Viola, this is your welcome. I will shortly introduce Viola in a moment. Let me just start by saying that this lecture tonight is part of our program on digital humanism. We have a digital humanism fellowship here at the Institute in cooperation actually with the Technical University or University of Technology in Vienna, TU Wien. We are very happy for this very well functioning, very nice collaboration. Also a very great thanks to my colleagues, our colleagues at the TU. And please let us also welcome very specially Hannes Wertner, Professor Hannes Wertner, former Dean of the Faculty of Informatics at TU Wien, and somebody who has been very influential and crucial for many projects relating to digital humanism in Vienna, and the initiator of very many things, among these also our fellowship program here at the IWM. Hannes, great that you can join us for this lecture tonight. Viola Schiaffonati is currently a visiting fellow here at the Institute, and since we do this in collaboration with TU, also a guest professor teaching at the TU Wien. In her normal life, Viola is a professor of logic and philosophy of science at the Politecnico di Milano. In Italy, they have this very interesting thing of bringing philosophers to the technical universities and not just having them there as some nice person to have there, but as somebody crucially related also to speaking to the people and being implemented in the curriculum. I think this is a very nice and interesting thing, and Viola is doing exactly this at the famous Politecnico di Milano. Her research includes the philosophy of AI and robotics, and especially one could say the very manifold ethical and philosophical issues around intelligent and autonomous systems. She has been a visiting scholar to very many universities and institutions. I refrain here from listing them. It's no sense of that, just trust me on that. She has also served as a member of the European Commission expert group on AI and data in education and training, among very many other things. And from her publications, I would just like to mention one book. This is a book that came out in Italian in 2020. You will also see a copy of the cover later on in her presentation. The English title would be Robots, Computers and Experiments. And I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that many books have been written maybe with the titles of robots and computers, but the interesting part, and I really think this is what makes Viola's research unique, is the third word, esperimenti, in Italian, experiments. Her approach is very much experiment based, and I think this is a very interesting part of what you're doing, Viola. From the articles, very many articles, again, I would like to mention those two that she has published in the 2 volumes of the Vienna Digital Humanism Group, 2 volumes that came out in 2021, respectively this year in 2024. In the first one, she contributed an article, once again, listen to the title, Explorative Experiments, adding an epistemic dimension to the ethical debate. I think this once again tells a lot already about her research. And for the later one coming out this year, an article on promises and perils in moralizing technologies. Both of these volumes were edited by, among others, Hannes Wertner and Erich Brehm. Erich Brehm here is in the first row here. He will be the commentator of tonight. Erich, also a very special welcome to you. And sorry for misspelling your name. I understand that in the English-speaking world you're Eric anyway, but here in Vienna you're still our Erich, so sorry for the misspelling. Erich Brehm will provide a commentary after Viola's talk. Erich is a computer scientist, AI expert, working at the University of Vienna, among very many other things, at the Department for Philosophy of Media and Technology. And Erich is somebody who has been interested and highly active in epistemological and ethical questions of AI for very many years. Erich, also very welcome to you, and thanks for taking over the job of the commentary. Viola, let's start.
Okay, so thank you very much for this invitation, not just for the talk, but of course for being here senior fellow at the Institute in the Digital Humanism program. It's almost the end of this fantastic period here in Vienna, so I'm sad already. And thank you so much for this invitation. So I need to readapt a little bit because otherwise I cannot see my slides. So hopefully I will not just... Okay. Okay, thank you. So, first of all, let me clarify a little bit what I want to focus today. And today I want to present my current research on the new sciences of the artificial. And of course, this label echoes, and it's not by chance, the title of Herbert Simon book, famous book, The Sciences of the Artificial. But because this research is a large and more than that, an ongoing project, today I will focus only on some parts, on some elements contributing to this. I will start from artificial intelligence and risk. Why artificial intelligence? Of course, the reason, but this is not the only reason, is that I've been a scholar in the field of the philosophy of artificial intelligence for more than 20 years. But also, and I think more importantly, artificial intelligence is increasingly and somehow silently being weighed into the very fabric of our society, the way we conduct business, how we make and nourish friendships. It's constantly influencing how we see the world, and in many cases reinforcing biases of different types. But then today, in focusing on AI and risk, I will try to adopt, hopefully, a different perspective from the usual ethical and social perspectives that are discussed today. I will argue that to solve, or at least to mitigate, some of the problems raised by artificial intelligence, the current technical, methodological, and also ethical and social reforms are not enough. Rather, we need conceptual reforms, and in particular, epistemological ones, and this is why we need philosophy. So in the first part of my talk, I will focus mainly on AI and risk, and I will argue that we need to enlarge a little bit the view on risk, in particular the view on risk that is at the core of the Artificial Intelligence Act today in Europe. Then I will focus on risk and uncertainty, and I will suggest that one of the ways to deal with this is to introduce the notion of explorative experimentation. Then, in the second part, I will argue that we need something new, such as the new sciences, rather than adopting something that is already existing, both in terms of methods and in terms of topics. And again, here, I will focus only on epistemological issues, but this is just a part. I'm not arguing that it's the only part. And once again, I will try to show that to deal with a specific crisis that I will use as a sort of example of what I'm discussing, that is the reproducibility crisis in artificial intelligence. I don't even think that we need to use crisis as a label here, but I will use as an example. Again, technical, methodological, social reforms are not enough, and we need conceptual reform. And then I will conclude. But then, before starting, let me just introduce one conceptual clarification today. I will use the label sciences of the artificial in a quite liberal way, not providing a very specific definition, but I will use a specific definition for artificial intelligence, more or less, because I'm very much aware of the problems in defining artificial intelligence as a discipline from the very beginning of its birth. But then I will also enlarge by using autonomous and intelligent systems, because I think it's important in the way that we can be more inclusive, like include fields like intelligent robotics. So let me start from AI-related risk and the discussion on risk today. And let me just get rid immediately from the problem of so-called existential risk. I think that today we have more serious risk to discuss, so I don't want to engage in this discussion, and examples of more serious risk are algorithmic discriminations, privacy violations, environmental problems, and so on. But let me now try to start from the Artificial Intelligence Act and then move beyond this framework, because as you probably know, the Artificial Intelligence Act is based on a categorization of 4 different types of risk, from unacceptable risk to minimal risk, and this is a way to frame the possible risk that can be raised by artificial intelligence systems. But in a sense, this notion of risk is like very specifically oriented, so rather than a coherent framework, we can see that there also in the literature, there are lists of risks associated to artificial intelligence, but not a coherent framework. So let me clarify that I don't want to criticize the Artificial Intelligence Act. I'm very much in favor, and I think it's a great achievement in Europe. But I want to enlarge from a philosophical point of view the idea and the notion of risk that is behind. So, of course, defining risk is very difficult. There's no univocal definition. There are technical and non-technical definitions of risk. This is the classic approach. So the classic approach deals with risk in probabilistic terms, but it's not the only approach. What I think it's interesting is today to try to build upon the classical elaboration on risk in conceptual terms that starts from the natural risk context and see whether we can use in particular, the components of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, also to the case of artificial intelligence. So before going into this direction, let me just mention and clarify these 3 components. So hazard is usually what is referred to the source of potential harm. And here we can see both in natural risk and technological risk, we can see that, for example, a natural risk example of a hazard is a volcanic eruption, and the technological one can be a data leakage. What about exposure? Exposure refers to what could be harm, both in terms of living beings, in terms of material assets, and here again we can see in terms of living beings, we can have people that are in a vicinity of a volcano. In terms of material assets, we have buildings, but we can also have like online services or some online services. And the third element is vulnerability. Vulnerability refers to the circumstances and also the measures that we can adopt to make people and assets less vulnerable to some risk. And for example, the case of a volcanic eruption, again, we can have like older odors with some specific ways of mitigating possible risk, but also in the case of technologies, we can have like that minors cannot use some technologies, or they cannot use like until some age. Why is this important? Of course, this is not important just from conceptual point of view, but it's also important because traditionally in natural risk assessment, this kind of decomposition into parts has an impact on policy, mitigation policies, okay? So for example, hazard can be reduced in terms of technological risk, but it's likely or very difficult to reduce in terms of natural risk. In terms of technological risk, you can address, you can enforce some prohibition, or you can withdraw a product from a market. In terms of exposure, exposure can be reduced both in natural risk and also in technological risk. Can be that you can deny access to some critical areas, or you can, again, put some age restrictions. And what about vulnerability? You can have different interventions to reduce vulnerability. You can have evacuation plans in the case of a volcanic eruption or an earthquake, but you can have other measures like antivirus software in the case of technological risk. So how these can be applied to the case of artificial intelligence, and in particular artificial intelligence system operating in critical contexts. Because so far we can see that much of the discussion has been mostly focused on the dimension of hazard. So for example, hazard is usually what is referred when we consider artificial intelligence in the context of very critical applications from medical AI or warfare scenarios and stuff like this. And when we consider a hazard, of course, this is very important. I'm not denying that this is a core element, but I'm just telling that usually we are just focusing on like problems that are related to the death of life of people, or some errors or malfunctions that really affect in a very strong sense people's lives. But I think that we should enlarge a little bit and see whether we can include into this analysis not just a hazard, but also vulnerability and exposure. And why? And this is, if you want to check more in detail this part, I've just published with a couple of colleagues a paper arguing on this, that this is important both for conceptualization and for mitigation. Why to introduce like exposure and vulnerability? Let me start with two basic, simple examples. So we have systems like, for example, recommender systems that are like, that at the beginning were not categorized as high risk in the Artificial Intelligence Act, because basically they are not impacting the people's lives in terms of deaths or in terms of serious hazard. But yet, if we look and reconceptualize these systems in terms of exposure, their exposure, in particular when they are embedded into social media, is very high. So, we can increase the level of risk by considering the dimension of exposure. And this is probably the reason, it's not explicit, but this is probably the reason why then recommender systems were relabeled after some amendments last year as high risky, differently from what they were at the beginning. So, and in a sense, here again, I want to stress it's not a matter of death of life, but it's a matter rather of a very large influence on many different levels. Let me now consider the second example that concerns vulnerability. Here, vulnerability plays an important role because, again, with some AI systems now are employed in traditionally vulnerable contexts, like with the older adults, or for example, for children in education, a hospital, and contexts that are traditionally labeled as vulnerable contexts. And again, these systems are not risky in terms of hazard, but they should be considered a little bit more high risk if we consider vulnerability. And if we consider, for example, how they are used in emotionally salient ways in the context of elderly care or education, particular education for children with special needs. Okay, so let me now just summarize this first part. I think that we should enlarge a little bit this notion of risk, because if we consider risk only in terms of hazard, we might miss important aspects. Like other examples are deep fakes. If we consider deep fakes in terms of exposure, we should increase the level of risk. And the same also emotion recognition system. You can see there that they are just labeled as limited risk, but again, if we consider them in terms of vulnerability, they should be reconceptualized. So, and let me move now to another example, and of course I cannot avoid to mention this example, general purpose AI systems, because this is an example that, in a sense, gives us the idea that to discuss all these issues only in terms of risk is not enough. And the example is related to general purpose AI systems used for variety of different purposes. These are systems that, in a sense, because they are designed to be adaptable for a variety of tasks, is very difficult to identify their risk. And this is the case of large language models that can be used in a variety of contexts. But also, it's not only difficult to have what we usually call ex-ante risk evaluation, so before they are deployed, but sometimes it's also very difficult to have what is called ex-post risk evaluation, because these systems are opaque, these systems are like proprietary systems, or these systems, we don't have enough information to better understand the level of risk. And so we have that it's very hard to not only to model them, but also to predict them. So here I want to introduce in a very short way also the dimension of uncertainty. And this is important because there are cases in which, if we adopt a traditional risk analysis in which we can elaborate and calculate, in a sense, risk in terms of probabilities, there are cases in artificial intelligence as well in which this is not possible, precisely because we don't know exactly what kind of risk can emerge and what the level of, the degree of uncertainty that we can have. And more than that, there is what it's usually labeled as severe uncertainty. So those forms of uncertainty that can resist like probabilistic treatment or any kind of formal quantification. So why is this important, and why uncertainty plays here a very important role? It is important because here again we need to recognize that uncertainty is not just one single concept, but is more nuanced. There are many different views, and also there are cases in which uncertainty cannot be quantified and, in a sense, even not known. Okay, so there's no just one single way to fit to have a formalization of uncertainty. So let me now move to what is very important for me now. This was just a sort of background, because uncertainty in AI plays today a very big role. And it's very important to consider that, in a sense, we can see uncertainty as at least an intrinsic dimension of some AI systems, especially when using some techniques, but also because these systems, not just because they are opaque or they are very complex or we don't have enough information, but because they interact in very complex socio-technical systems, and this makes uncertainty even not just at the level of the artifacts, but also at the level of the interaction. So why this uncertainty here plays an important role? Again, because it's a sort of double role at the level of the artifact, but also at the level of the interaction with the artifacts in the context of use. And this makes sometimes very difficult to understand how these systems will actually work before they are inserted into the context of use. And this comes the idea that how we can deal with this. Of course, there are many different ways. So my proposal is that we can deal by using experimentation, okay? But these forms of experimentation, or a specific form of experimentation that I'm going to discuss in a minute, is a specific way to deal with this uncertainty. So let me now move to that part on experimental technologies and explorative experiments. So first of all, let me introduce the label experimental technologies. So experimental technologies are not just AI systems. Usually this is a label used for emergent technologies. Another example is nanotechnologies, for instance, but they are defined as those technologies for which their introduction is something that comes with large uncertainty. And basically, this large uncertainty makes very difficult to predict how this system will behave, how this system will work before they are deployed in the context of use. And this is, I think that in a sense, this label is very general, but at the same time very useful. Why? Because in a sense, this makes us also ready to reconsider how we should deal with experimentation with these experimental technologies. And sorry for this very much experimental use in many different ways. Why? Because so far, I would say that so far the scholarly debate basically has moved and focused mostly on like trying to provide ethical safeguards or ethical frameworks to try to deal with these experimental technologies. So a lot of work has been done on this. Let me mention a very nice example. This is a quite old paper trying to elaborate ethical frameworks to deal with these experimental technologies. And these frameworks is based on the 4 classical principles of bioethics, and then it's further articulated into 16 specific conditions. But here, I want to re-elaborate this idea and this kind of approach by reversing like the usual kind of priority in this sense. So usually we consider the ethical and social issues, but then now I want to start from the epistemological issues that can be at the basis of the ethical ones. And here, what I think is a very important question is the following. Does it make sense to apply the same standards of the natural sciences, like, for example, the standard of control experimentation, that is one of the pillars of natural sciences, to the sciences of the artificial? And now I will elaborate a bit on this. So first of all, I think that, let me clarify one point. I don't want to say that we need to just get rid of the traditional idea of experimentation, or that we need a completely new idea of experiment. Just two clarifications. First, I think that this idea of explorative experimentation is just another idea in a sort of plurality of views and methods for the experimental methodology that can be together with other views of experimentation. And second point that I want to clarify is that I don't want to say that all experiments in artificial intelligence are forms of explorative experiments. What I want to say is that there are, however, some special types of experiments in which experiments are not carried out to test theories, like in the more traditional way, but they are carried out to test technical artifacts. And technical artifacts are physical objects that have been designed with a function and a use plan. So here, experiments, in a sense, have a sort of normative component that is important. So I don't have time to articulate all the elements of explorative experimentation. Let me just mention one of these elements, that is the notion of control. And why control? Because usually control is a key element in the definition of experiments, okay? We can control the variables in a way that we can manipulate a phenomenon or a set of phenomena to test theories, to check a hypothesis, and so on. And as Ludger mentioned, I wrote this book just to give the idea that there are other types of experiments, in particular in some fields. I focus here mostly on intelligent robotics, but to give the idea that some experiments are experiments in which, even if we can maintain the centrality of the notion of control, and in particular of experimental control, we need to relax a little bit this idea of control, and this is why I've introduced the notion of a posteriori control. So here again, I think that control plays a very important role in any kind of experimentation. This is an open debate in philosophy of science, but anyway, I also at the same time believe that we should also include other forms of control. So this comes to what I was discussing. Forms of control in which we can have, like, we cannot control the experimental factors from the very beginning, but only when they are, and in a partial way, inserted in their context of use. And so, for example, we cannot have like the safeguards that we have in traditional experimentations, such as blinding, which is technique to make or to try to avoid some possible mistakes and problems related to control of the experimental factors, and we have to find other ways of dealing with these problems. So, and why is this important? Because I do believe, and I articulated elsewhere this part, that when we start from the idea of explorative experiments and weaker forms of control, these can have an impact also at the ethical and social levels. So we can embrace forms of, let's call them ethical incrementalism, in which basically we can have a gradual introduction of AI systems into the context of use, and also to check about some possible problems, emerging risk, and we can try to learn from this experience, include this experience in the redesign of these systems, and, this is very important, to step back if needed. It means that we should also consider situations in which we can stop and decide not to use some systems because they are perhaps too risky or too dangerous. So, but this is only a part of the larger project that I was mentioning, and it's a part in which I'm focusing on the methods, or some of the methods, of the new sciences of the artificial. Let me now move to the second part, and I'm checking time because I know Ludger will cut me in. Okay, so let me focus on the second part. I know that I'm just giving you a partial view of a larger project, but it's very important for me to at least being able to present parts of this larger project. And the second part is, okay, but why do we need something new? And this question can be articulated in this way. So the first way is, many people and scholars and colleagues tell me, okay, why not to consider the methods, the experimental methods of other disciplines, whether they are like the natural sciences or even the social sciences? Why do you need to invent a new form of experimentation to just explain or to deal with these problems? And this is one part. The other part is, okay, but artificial intelligence is not even a science, so you don't need to use the traditional methods of science. It's an engineering discipline, so you should conceptualize it as an engineering discipline and use the traditional methods of the engineering discipline. And the other side of, of this discussion is, why something new if you have already this wonderful book, The Sciences of the Artificial, that covers a lot of parts, topics, and it's very comprehensive. So why do we need something new right now? And this is my main hypothesis, and it's still a hypothesis in a sense, but the hypothesis is we need a new kind of science that is in part in continuation and in part in, let's say, discontinuation with the traditional notion of science. I don't have time to cover all these points, so I will just cover 2 points in this larger picture. The first part, why I don't think that we should always use the same methods of the natural sciences. And here I will focus on a specific example that is called the reproducibility crisis in artificial intelligence. Why I do want to focus on this example? Because there's a lot of discussion on this, and because reproducibility is one of the pillars of the scientific method. And is one of the pillars because usually guarantees like trust in scientific result, more or less. So, and again, here, when we discuss about the reproducibility crisis, in a sense, there are pieces and papers and articles that, again, says that there is a crisis in artificial intelligence. Let me mention this one, but also this more recent one. There's a crisis in artificial intelligence in terms of reproducibility of its results, and we should try to make artificial intelligence closer to the scientific standards of the natural sciences. Here, again, I want to argue that technological, technical, methodological, and social reforms are not enough. And again, to reframe this problem of the reproducibility crisis of artificial intelligence, we need conceptual reforms. So let me just present in a very sketchy way the debate, and the debate is, okay, because artificial intelligence deals with code, the problem of reproducibility should not even be addressed, but this is not true, because people and researchers do not share their codes, their programs, for many reasons, okay? They could be practical reasons, they could be more like political reasons, and so on. And there's a lot of literature trying to quantify the state of reproducibility in artificial intelligence research. And the idea is, okay, the hypothesis usually in these papers is very clear, basic. Okay, artificial intelligence does not document in a good way their results, so results in artificial intelligence are not reproducible or are not well reproducible. And this is usually important because it's framed in the context of also considering trust and considering results that are not reproducible, results that cannot be trust or not trust completely. But it's also interesting that if you look at this, this is not even a paper, this is a policy report for the EACD and how artificial intelligence is like playing a very important role in science. And here you can see that it's not just that we should increase reproducibility in artificial intelligence for trust, but also to increase productivity. Okay, so very basic and specific reasons. And the causes of the crisis has been elaborated not only in artificial intelligence, but in many fields. For example, one field in which this so-called crisis of reproducibility played a very important role is psychology, and usually there are different reasons from like bad research practices or from problems related to technical specific issues or low statistical power, or even like new label to explain kind of new phenomena. But then let's consider now the remedies for this crisis. And one basic remedy that is being articulated in the literature is like, let's have a better documentation. This is the problem. We have this problem. This is the solution. So we should have, and this is just an example, papers that report data and code according to some kind of guidelines. So many of these remedies are articulated in the direction of having a better documentation that should guarantee, in a sense, the reproducibility of results in artificial intelligence. But my question here is really code sharing the solution of this problem, of this crisis? And as you can imagine, my answer is no, because in artificial intelligence we have a lot of many other information, not just code, that plays a very important role for like doing experiments. And it's true that the community is doing a lot and also trying to find ways to standardize these processes, but at the same time I find that this quote is still very important, even if goes back to some years ago. The exact way that you run your experiment is full of undocumented assumptions and decisions. A lot of these details never makes into papers. And this is, I think it's a very important point, because remind me of what in philosophy of science, the sociology of science, has always been playing a very important role, that is the notion of tacit knowledge. And I want to mention this wonderful book, because this is a book in which not only tacit knowledge is defined as our ability to perform skills without being able to articulate how we do them, but it's also a wonderful book because it reconstructs with a lot of details that a lot of results in physics as well cannot be reproduced. And the example that is discussed for a large part of the paper is like, for example, the possibility to replicate the construction of a laser without including some tacit knowledge, without having some tacit knowledge. So this is a wonderful example, because usually physics is considered like the golden standard in the reproducibility of results, and usually people in artificial intelligence looks at physics to have like the standards of clear and well done experimentation. So let me consider another remedy, that is openness. So openness means that, and there's a lot of huge discussion on this, that we can have more like open, not just open documentation, but also practices that make clear what are the, for example, intentions of an experiment, or what is being investigated into a paper. Like, for example, experimental pre-registrations are exactly in this direction. You pre-register your intention, so you cannot then change these intentions, trying to make them in accordance with the results that you have produced. And there's also, like, this debate is also framed within the larger framework of open science that is very important. And here is a short piece on Nature discussing how open science is particularly important in the case of artificial intelligence in particular, because we have, again, a lot of problems, and openness is a way to solve them. But in a sense, I think that here we should consider, and again, try to step back from this discussion and try to see this discussion from a larger perspective. And the larger perspective is, once again, that in science, if we look at the history and philosophy of science, we can see that there are many examples in which, in a sense, openness is guaranteed, but yet results cannot be reproduced. And this is not only an epistemological problem in a sense, but it's a sort of ethical, political one, in the sense that usually those sciences or those parts of sciences that cannot be reproduced according to these strict criteria are not even considered scientific. And this can make a huge difference. Think, for example, in terms of like fundings or like authority of science. So, in a sense, there are fields and parts of fields in which reproducibility is a sort of unreasonable epistemic expectations. So let me now discuss the last remedy that is usually put on the table when discussing the reproducibility crisis in artificial intelligence. That is, okay, so we need social reforms. We need to change the community and the practices of the community. Like, for example, like here, major conference in artificial intelligence and machine learning. So we should have like a source code of any paper published in these conferences made available, and so on. But my question again is, all this enough? Like, from technical, methodological, social reforms, is this enough? I don't want to say that these reforms are not important. I don't want to deny that it's important to share, to open practices and results, but I want to say that it's also important to consider, to again enlarge a little bit the view, and to consider that we need conceptual reforms. And this is why I do think that philosophy still plays a very important role. And here, of course, it's plenty of directions that we could take, but let me mention two directions only. The first one is to consider more generally the limits of replicability or reproducibility. I'm using the terms in an interchangeable way. And the second is, on the basis of this, to reconsider, to rethink reproducibility. So what about the limits? Here the limits have been already discussed a lot, and in a sense I think that it's interesting to reconsider reproducibility, not a universal standard, not a normative standard to make a demarcation between what is scientific and what is not scientific, but rather to reconsider it like as a local standard, in which it's important to consider the nature of the object of investigation, but also to consider different questions and different setups, even to include ideas or even to include contexts in which this ideal of replicability is not plausible, not even plausible. What about rethinking reproducibility? Again, rethinking reproducibility means to move ahead and to move beyond the idea that reproducibility is a way to demarcate science from not science or from non-science. And here, what I think is important, again, is to move along a plurality of views, definitions, approaches to reproducibility. So here, I would say that to summarize a message for this part of the talk is try to go beyond a sort of monolithic account of reproducibility that is usually a bit presented in the so-called discussion of the reproducibility crisis in artificial intelligence. Because yes?
I said I don't want to cut you off, but maybe I can ask you to now nicely wrap it up.
Yes.
Good, thank you.
And the point is that things are more nuanced, and I think that we should use this quote from a very famous philosopher of experimentation, in which we ask reproducibility of what and by whom. So let me skip these examples on a way of considering reproducibility a little bit more nuanced, and let me go to that part, and then I will conclude by considering Simon's book and Simon's approach. So, and rethinking reproducibility also means to reconsider cases in the history of science in which we have very well-grounded scientific results. This is just an example in which results were not reproduced or were poorly reproduced. And the title here, I think, is already clear enough: 2 as good as 100. So here, my point here is that, okay, reproducibility is not only difficult, we have problems, should not be regarded as a universal standard, but if we want to take an inspiration from other sciences, like in the case of experimental methods, if we want to take inspiration from physics, I think that also we should take inspiration from the history and philosophy of science and see that also these traditional standards are really more complex, more nuanced, more articulated than we usually think. So let me now conclude by considering the last part. And I will consider this part. So if you remember, one point was why not using the experimental methods of physics? The second part was why not using in these sciences of the artificial attempt to just use Herbert Simon's framework, why you need to provide something new. And I want to conclude by mentioning this long quote. This is from a paper that Simon wrote with lifelong colleague Newell after they got the Turing Award. And here, I think it's a wonderful paper, but here this quote is very interesting because it gives us the idea that, in a sense, computer science is a very special science. So is a very special science, and is a science in which, of course, people, researchers do experiments, but these experiments are of a very special type. So I want to conclude by, of course, recognizing that this paper and also Simon's works played a very important role in recognizing the peculiarities of artificial intelligence and computer science in general. So I don't want to deny that this book and many papers played a major role for the foundations of the so-called science of design. But at the same time, I think that parts of this project, and this is just an example that tells us that neither machines nor programs are black boxes. They are artifacts that have been designed, both hardware and software, and we can open them up and look inside. We can relate their structure to their behavior and draw many lessons from a single experiment. So here, I think that this is a good example on why we need to revise this project. And we need to revise this project because today, I think that we are not anymore in this situation. We have black boxes. We have partly different types of machines, and so we need a new science of the artificial. That means that, of course, we need more to found and to put a solid foundations for the new science. And I guess also that we need to move the traditional symbol processing system that was proposed by Simon. So this is the very last slide, just a wrap up of what I try to convey tonight. My first message is that we need a new framework that is partly in continuation but partly also different from what already exists when we want to reason on the sciences of the artificial. We need philosophy, and of course I'm not saying that we need only philosophy, but we need philosophy because some of these issues have a conceptual nature, so philosophy can play a role here. And also, even if I focus only today mostly on the epistemic and methodological issues, I think that they can play a role for also the ethical and social impacts. So I know that there is a lot to do. I just presented, as I told you, just some parts of these, but I hope to have at least explain why I do believe that we need something new. Thank you.
So thank you, Viola, for this presentation. I will now ask Eric to join us for a commentary and a practical remark. Artificial systems have seemingly different needs than biological systems, than us human beings. So I understand that it was a bit too cold, but I just have to explain we needed this because otherwise the beamer did not like it. So this was, we will now try to slowly heat it up a bit again. It will be better. So Erich, please.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you very much, Viola, for this wonderful I wasn't expecting an epistemology of AI, but this is fantastic. Of course, I still have to. So a commentary is always supposed to add something, and that is difficult because it's a very new field and sometimes critical. So let me first say, how can you ask the question whether we need philosophy? Don't even ask that question. But of course, there is a sense in which I believe the question is kind of evident, and that is when people are confused, when fields are moving in at least questionable directions, then usually philosophy steps in, and there have been cases in the past where whole branches of science have been critically received by philosophers, and when philosophers changed notions and concepts, and although I'm not an analytical philosopher, of course, a lot of it is then, let's say, repair on the concepts used in theories and things like that. And so I think, if nothing else, this is an important role to play. But of course, in AI, suddenly the tasks for philosophers have exploded, as you mentioned, from ethics to epistemology, even ontology. Philosophy is everywhere, and it's not because philosophers necessarily want to discuss these things, but because there's a real need. There is a high demand of clarifying those concepts. So I think your contribution pointing out the question of reproducibility, of one of the many questions, and and giving it a little bit of a new spin, I would say, is hugely relevant for the discipline. Yeah. Let me first start with saying something about the risks, because I was recently invited to write a paper on risks, and we are always discussing the AI risks, but of course we also should occasionally look at the risks on the other side, and now I mean the companies. So this is just really an add-on. It's not at all what you talked about, but I just want to point out that for companies, these risks then materialize in very different risks, in business risks. They may be innovation risks. For example, technology lock-in is one of those. Technology risks, obviously security risks. Cybersecurity is just one of them. Public relation risks, I think, is one of the greatest ones. This is actually a reason why many companies do not invest in AI technologies, because they actually are fearful of one of the risks that you mentioned materialize. Regulatory risks, legal risks, human resource risks, and market risks are other risks that kind of mirror all these risks on the industry side. And the real work for us, maybe not so much for the philosophers, maybe more for the engineers, is bridging from those risks to these risks and finding means to address them. So I think Floridi has called it from how to what, or something similar. And this is the challenge where we are now, and where we realize that sometimes doing this bottom up by looking into the cases may be more productive than coming from the high theories. Mm-hmm. So, but in this sense, I think this is just complementary to what you said. Now, the sciences of the artificial. So I think the fact of the matter is that unfortunately engineering is in a state where it has a relatively bad epistemology still. So even the question, what is engineering really, doesn't have a very good answer. And it has, I don't know, you're probably not aware of this, but it has had a big struggle. So the engineers, including here in Vienna, they have a history of having to fight for being an academic discipline. It was not recognized as a proper academic discipline, and I think maybe some people still think this today. But what is it? It's not a natural science, obviously, as you pointed out. It's not physics. So I would argue engineering is about constructability. And in a sense, it's also guided by hypotheses. The hypotheses are constructability hypotheses. And so the knowledge that we build is knowledge about how to build things and acquire, accumulate knowledge on how to best do this. And this may in part have let's say a partial answer to the problem that you're pointing to, because it does not mean that we need to completely analyze every single instance. I think that is a misunderstanding. That is hardly ever true in architecture, for example. What we expect is that from studying those systems, we gain, if you like, categorical knowledge at a level that allows us to build better systems. And so, while of course reproducibility would be nice, and I slightly disagree, we are still trying to open those systems. So I've just recently seen a handful of wonderful talks about analyzing large language models and hypothesizing what's in them. And this is completely irreproducible, because the language model that you're using today may not be the one that's out there tomorrow, because the companies keep changing them every day, or maybe not every day, but every month. And this is largely undocumented. You have no idea what's going on. But we can still we do these analysis, and still I believe in the end, and now I'm of course becoming a complete pragmatist, in the end we will construct useful knowledge from interaction with those systems. And this is not reliant on, are you making noises because I should stop? No.
This is my natural habit.
Sorry.
But I will get you the papers.
Thanks. So I'm becoming a pragmatist and say, as long as we can build knowledge that educates a generation of engineers that builds better systems from this, it's fine. But I would agree indeed, and no, I don't think many people have pointed this out, this is not a scientific approach. So I completely agree with that. So poor epistemology needs to be improved. And of course, as a philosopher of technology, I just want to point out, before you have science, you have engineering. Not many people know this. So I doubt there is philosophers of technology in the room. But in order to do science, you need instruments. And these instruments are usually constructed. So construction is before science. But don't tell this to physicists. Okay, final remarks, sciences of the artificial. So for a moment I was afraid you would propose to apply Newell's insights, which were great, by the way. I mean, at the time, I don't know if you know this, Newell and Simon received the Turing Award for their contribution to AI, actually, and cognitive science. I guess mostly, I think mostly for the physical symbol systems hypothesis, arguing that physical symbol systems have the sufficient and necessary means for creating intelligent action. And that created, in turn, a long controversy in the field of engineering and in science, which is interesting, between the symbol people and the subsymbolic people. So now, some people today claim the connectionists have won the game. I am not so sure. I think this stands to be discussed and proven. For the moment, the connectionists are in the lead, but we shouldn't forget about all the negative effects of those systems. But what I really wanted to go down to is Newell proposes a particular way in his book. It's a methodological book. He says how we should study the artificial, and basically I'm not going to repeat the whole story, but basically it's a very computer programming, computer software-like way of looking at things by compartmentalizing systems, reducing the problem to interfaces so that we have similar systems, and we build complex systems out of simple systems, and then we study those complex systems by putting those simple systems together, and he argued this is a proper way of studying systems. And then we can simulate these systems, which is the second step, and basically we will always be able to simulate any I/O behavior by this methodology, and he makes a linearity assumption. Sorry, it's a bit technical now, I have to do this. And then by putting these things together, we can simulate anything. And here I'm not following completely, as an old connectionist also, because this is a non-holistic way of looking at things, and if we look at today's systems, the reason why they are so difficult to explain is precisely the opposite, because it's precisely so difficult to tear them apart, compartmentalize the system, and thus predicting with reasonable error what's going on. That's not the case for those systems. So this I think is a good thing. I think here we can look at the theory of Newell and say, okay, so where is this deviation? Where is it coming from? And in this sense, I really think we should go back to, I think your theory should be called the new sciences of the artificial, because he wrote a paper, the new sciences of the artificial, where he included AI and cognitive systems. And in the interest of time, I think I'll just leave it there. But thanks again for the insightful talk.
Much.
Thank you as well, Eric. So Viola, I hope you agree. Since we are a bit running out of time, I would want to have at least some 10-15 minutes for questions and remarks, discussion with the audience. That would be nice. So maybe if you restrict yourself to a short comment on the very many things that Eric mentioned, and then we will open up and have at least a short discussion. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for these comments. Just let me focus on this last part. So this idea of a sort of holistic view, I think it's the most important part. I don't know how to articulate, in the new sciences of the artificial. But I really think I'm just rereading Simon's book many times, and I see that this science of design is really fitting many of the things that we have today, but yet this holistic part is the part that is missing in a sense. But that part, at the same time, also to move too much in the direction of the engineering disciplines and sciences, I think it's not enough in a sense, because probably we should try to recollect artificial intelligence as like it was at the beginning, as both a science and an engineering. This was very clear. For example, Nils Nilsson defined artificial intelligence this way, but I think that this holistic, so thank you very much for this comment, because I think that this holistic idea, it is something that I definitely think it's worth considering.
Okay. Lachlan, would you please wait for the mic? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Viola, for this talk. Throughout the whole, you were referring to the sciences in the talk as, one of the main sciences that you've suggested we need to move beyond is physics in one sense, but the one that I was thinking of throughout your talk was biology and pharmaceuticals in particular, in which there is a great amount of uncertainty in terms of the way in which a drug interacts with the body and with different kinds of body, yet there can be a lot of certainty about the development of that drug, and there should be a lot of certainty about the likely reaction of that drug with certain bodies. And I was thinking that if the answer in this case were to stretch the idea of reproducibility and to say, for certain drugs, we don't need necessarily to have a reproducible idea of them, or we don't need to have clinical trials in the same way that clinical trials are structured. This would hand a lot of power to the pharmaceutical companies in terms of telling us that a drug is good for us, whereas it may be good for us, but it may have other effects that are in their interest as well. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the way in which you see AI as distinct from this kind of dual engineering science of pharmaceuticals and biology.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, Lachlan. And of course, what I think it's important, I don't want to say that we don't need clinical trials anymore or reproducibility in that kind of field. At the same time, I recognize that different degrees of uncertainty are playing a very important role. But again, I want to move to the part in which we focus on the science of design in the sense of like artificial intelligence. The goal, one of the goals, is to design technical artifacts with a function. And so this is, I think, it's very peculiar, because we have a kind of different direction of fit with respect to like the artifact and the reality, the artifact that in a sense represent a part of the reality and the reality. And in this sense, in the case of artificial intelligence, it's a sort of paradoxical, I would say, the case to introduce uncertainty, because in a sense it seems that, okay, we are dealing with artifacts. These artifacts have been designed by humans, by designers, with a technical function in mind, having very clear this. So it should be clear that how they have been designed, how they've been shaped in a way to fulfill this technical function. But because of the complexity of the artifacts, and more than that, also because of the complexity of the interaction, we don't have this knowledge. And in a sense, sometimes people do experiments, and it's a form of experimentation that is focusing on the artifacts themselves, not like, for example, like in clinical trials, how people can react or the effects of a drug on different patients and so on. So this is very special. We don't have time to elaborate on this, but it's special in the sense that, and again, here we are moving a little bit in the direction of the engineering disciplines or engineering sciences. But this is one of the peculiarities. And this is why I think that we should focus on these peculiarities, because it's important, not just for clarification purposes, but because it's important that if we recognize these peculiarities, we are better prepared to address them.
Yeah, Holly?
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. And my question is about something that you mentioned towards the end. You said that reproducibility should be considered as a local standard. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what that means. And you said reproducibility by whom and for what. And I'm particularly thinking about when you were addressing the matter of exposure and vulnerability earlier in the talk. Those are basically matters of scale, and they become scalar concerns because technologies don't, even if they are created for a specific intended purpose, they are often used for purposes besides those specific intended purposes. So if we're considering kind of reproducibility locally, do we precisely not see the potential for harm in terms of other possible applications? Or what is it that you understand under thinking reproducibility locally?
So to consider reproducibility as a local standard, first of all, is to try to get rid of a whole philosophical problem that is the problem of demarcation. Here in Vienna, I think is still a serious problem because it was the Vienna Circle to discuss, at least in current terms, this demarcation problem. So what makes a distinction between what is scientific and not scientific? And of course, reproducibility is, at least in the debate of reproducibility crisis and artificial intelligence, is used as a demarcation in this sense. So you are not scientific if you are not, your results are not reproducible. But I think that to recognize for whom and for what means that there are also, looking back at the history of science, examples in which results are not reproduced in the standard ways, but still they have what we can usually use the label of scientific evidence, or something that we can consider anyway accountable in terms of knowledge. So first of all, my distinction goes in this direction. So we should not use as a demarcation and as a sort of normative kind of account to what is bad or good science. And this is serious in the case of artificial intelligence and computer science as well. And it's serious because there's a lot of debates in the direction of trying to make computer science more scientific by adopting the same standards of the other sciences. And again, this is a way of not recognizing the peculiarities. I'm not saying that artificial intelligence is completely different, but not recognizing some peculiarities. Regarding the second part, very interesting. I need to think about this because I didn't connect the reproducibility with respect to the part of risk. So thank you very much for this suggestion. I will think about it.
Please.
Thank you, Viola. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the talk. There's a lot of things I think that were new to me, and I guess one of these was in, I think in your slide 33, you mentioned that there was a reproducibility in AI. And as I wasn't aware of this before, and to the best of my knowledge, the landmark papers in AI, such as Attention is All You Need, which is the framework which all the large language models use, these are reproducible. So I'm wondering what exactly is the reproducibility crisis in AI? What specific results are the ones that cannot be reproduced?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is exactly the two slides that I basically skipped, and I was mentioning two very interesting and recent papers discussing reproducibility in machine learning, and these, to the best of my knowledge, these are the only papers so far that try to elaborate on the fact that reproducibility in the case of machine learning and even subfields of machine learning have specific problems and challenges, and so these challenges are not general for artificial intelligence, not even for machine learning. And some of these challenges are due to the fact that these processes are not deterministic, and but there are also other challenges. And it's interesting that they try to categorize like the different difficulties in terms of not just of technical difficulties, but also some of them we might call intrinsic. But this is really quite new, because so far what I have seen, and I've been studying this for a while, it's again to try to see, okay, artificial intelligence, computer science are not scientific enough, so let's try to be more scientific by adopting the traditional standards of sciences.
I wanted to add one point. I think you alluded to it, but you didn't mention the example. There are, of course, cases where we don't want to reproduce things, or you cannot reproduce them. A volcanic explosion only happens once, and that's it, and you don't want to generate a new one. And hyperinflation theories, you don't want to create. That's a famous example, I think. So there are many of these examples. So while reproducibility is an important criterion, we are quite happy in many disciplines to work without them and find workarounds.
Angelika?
Thank you very much for the talk. This really addressed a lot of things I'm also thinking about in terms of risks and harms and scientificness as well. And my question, so something I've been concerned with are AI systems that are used in a way that I would say are unscientific, and what I mean by that is that they are based on assumptions that are disproven in other fields of science. So, for example, in psychology, it's microexpressions for lie detection are disproven, and they use it now with machine learning for exactly the same purpose in AI. So, my question is sort of how do these different standards then of scientificness sort of link, or how would you see the relation of that you use an AI system, and you've also mentioned in your definition of AI that it is used in another field, that it has an impact on the world, and that rest of the world, be it physics, psychology, or medicine, as in Lachlan's example, also has standards for scientificness or reproducibility, and I feel like sometimes it's skipped, and I feel like with what you're sort of trying to do, this could be a further way to skip that, yeah. And to not prove the assumptions from different fields that go into the AI.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, but I will not put this in terms of scientificity or not. But one of the reasons I do think we need the new sciences of the artificial is precisely because today, basically, without any, we are just like a part of huge experimentation without the traditional standards of experimentation. So, and then I understand, like, for example, the introduction of large language models into the context in which basically from one day to another everybody was able to use them, and being part of a large experimentation without the usual safeguards of experimentation with humans is precisely in this direction. But then at the same time, so I do think that to frame in terms of explorative experiment can be a way to recognize that perhaps we have a different notion of experimental control, like we cannot have like what we have in clinical trials, for example, but still we can have some forms of control. And so this is why I think this is thank you for the question, because this is again another example I didn't have time to mention on why to reframe these problems into a larger conceptual framework can have a very concrete impact.
Can I support this just a little bit? Because I think this is a very good example. I mean, and machine learning is, of course, not the discipline that was completely new in understanding or trying to understand how to build models and then how to evaluate them and how to make sure that you're not making mistakes with the data. Statisticians have done this before, but for some reason, and for good reasons, in machine learning, this has now become really important, and we at the universities, we're really trying to make sure that people understand all the mistakes that you could possibly make. And I think this is an important takeaway message. In a sense, this part of the work is like trying to put all the epistemology into a few rules of procedure and then analyzing those models and making sure that this is really the model that you thought you had developed. Yeah? But this is, of course, really tricky, and you can make many mistakes. Yeah? So, but again, I think here we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but turn it around and say, we understand this much better now than we did only 10 years ago, for example.
So I suggest we come to an end for today, and there's a good reason why I say we come to an end for today, because I will have a short announcement afterwards. I will have, in fact, two very short announcements afterwards. But first we make use of this opportunity and we give a really big thank you to both of you, to Viola Schiaffonati and Erich Brehm.